Thanks very much. It's good to be back here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. I suspect I've spent as much time in this place as many of the newer employees. As I pointed out, I go back to Peter Brannon, who I met the year before his retirement in 1967. I came to know the late Milo Howard and became his friend when I was working here in the 80s. And then, of course, Ed Bridgers is a longtime friend. I've outlasted them all somehow. I don't think I'll outlast Steve unless he steps in front of a car in a busy crosswalk, however. Last March, Debbie Pendleton invited me to speak today, and Amy Williamson has been gently reminding me of my commitment over the last few months. Obviously, she has dealt with absent-minded professors in the past, and I know that Debbie had hoped I would make some connections between the Alabama of George Wallace and that of today. My apologies in advance for shirking that charge. I've always been interested in the history of politics of the state, but the truth is, having moved to North Carolina full-time some years ago, my shrinking cerebrum has been challenged to master the history and politics of my new home state. So you'll forgive me, I hope, if my palate is less Alabama and more national. I also ask you to excuse the personal tone of my comments. In part, I suspect it's a product of aging. This week I saw my grandson off to college, which is both a joyous moment and also a reminder that time marches on. But maybe you'll understand as you listen to my comments why I say this. As a historian, I've always been concerned about the truthfulness of our recreation of the past, but I also share the view of the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy that the study of the past should ultimately lead to some form of moral reflection. At its best, a conversation with the past can do more than inform us about what people have said and done. It can also help us to think about how we should live. So forewarned is forearmed. My interest in George Wallace began in the early 1960s. As a student at the University of South Carolina with very deep Southern roots, I abandoned what had been my commitment to the Southern way of life. And even though my civil rights activism hardly matched that of friends like John Lewis and Julian Bond and Bob Zellner, I had been active in the civil rights movement in South Carolina, although there you were more likely to be scolded than having your collarbone rearranged. We're very polite, and we were very polite in South Carolina. When the newly elected Alabama governor gave his inaugural speech in 1963 promising segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, I was a first-year graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, and I distinctly remember the sense of embarrassment I felt as a white Southerner in this predominantly liberal Midwestern state university. But that embarrassment became anger when I saw him speak to a packed auditorium on the university campus in February of 1964. As I leaned against the back wall in that standing room only crowd, I watched frustrated civil rights activists, including my friend Bob Zellner, challenge the Alabama governor as he combined down-home humor with a defense of the Southern way of life, all couched in abstract constitutional terms. Adeptly, as he was to do in the future, he turned aside the attacks of angry protesters, depicting himself as a victim of closed-minded fanatics who would deny him his constitutional right of free speech. By the end of the hour, the majority of the audience was laughing at Governor Wallace's self-deprecating jokes, applauding his adeptness at deflecting his frustrated inquisitors. And I think I was less angry at Governor Wallace for the answers he gave than for the gullibility with which most of the students seemed to accept his assurances that blacks in Alabama were guaranteed the right to vote, given separate but equal educational opportunities, and fully protected from violence. However frustrated I may have been, I saw him in an entirely new light. George Wallace may have been the latest in that bloodline of white Southern politician who manipulated race for political ends, but I never doubted after that evening that this was no typical Dixie demagogue. By the end of the 1980s, it was less hostility than intellectual curiosity that drew me to his life story. This was, after all, an individual who had shocked national opinion leaders by emerging from the Deep South in 1964 to capture from 33 to 45% of the vote in 3 northern Democratic primaries. In 1968, against enormous odds, he had put together one of the most successful third-party efforts of the 20th century, raising, corrected for inflation, $125 million in small contributions. And in mid-May of 1972, at the time he was struck down by would-be assassin Arthur Bremer, he was one of the leading Democratic presidential candidates in both votes and primary wins, North and South. There was, I think, little likelihood that he would be elected president. He was too raw, too Southern. But he had been and was one of the most significant transitional figures in American politics. Poltergeist and weather vane in the America of the age of Aquarius. And he may have begun as a one-dimensional Southern governor, but this former New Deal Democrat moved to national prominence on the basis of a new agenda that blended traditional elements of that tradition, a conservative tradition, as well as his own Democratic background, particularly his incorporation of the new social agenda, discussed over the Supreme Court's rejection of prayer in the schools and its protection of, as he never failed to point out, dirty books, angry denunciations of busing, and a general resentment over the expenditure of public resources for the undeserving poor. Most of all, with an extraordinarily skillful use of what we now call code words, he had made it possible to use race in national presidential campaigns in a way that would have seemed unthinkable in the early 1960s. In tracing the line that runs directly from Governor Wallace's stand in the schoolhouse door to Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, through Ronald Reagan's amiable harangues against welfare queens, to George Bush's use of the Willie Horton case, I think it is incontestable that he taught politicians how to navigate the shoals of political correctness to appeal to resentful white voters, North and South. And in practical terms, he had a profound impact on the balance of political power in American politics by playing a critical role in helping white Southerners sever themselves from their traditional Democratic Party allegiance, paving the way for an emergent Republican South, a Republican South that has served as a foundation for the GOP and many of the conservative political successes during the last 35 years. This was the 1980s. What actually triggered this was I was teaching a course on America since World War II. And I began looking not only at what had been written, but how the governor was seen. Here's what I found intriguing. By the time Ronald Reagan left office in 1989, political conservatives spoke reverently of their new founding fathers, Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan. Some of them even had occasional kind words for the disgraced Richard Nixon. But somehow, they had managed to create a virgin birth explanation for the most dramatic shift in 20th century American politics, the transformation from a solid Democratic South to a nearly solid Republican one in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. If Barry Goldwater was a powerful attraction and Ronald Reagan closed the deal, Governor Wallace had played a key role in this process. But what I quickly learned was that the man from Alabama was the red-headed bastard at every conservative family reunion, politely ignored in the hopes that he would go away. And it wasn't just conservatives for whom Wallace was a man who wasn't there. The same disappearing act took place in the initial historical accounts of the 1960s, most written by American liberals. Theodore White, the author of that series on the making of the presidents that revolutionized journalistic reporting on presidential campaigns, White could barely mention his name. Spent 2 pages at most on Governor Wallace. Historian William O'Neill's 1971 book, Coming Apart, an Informal History of America in the 1960s, was a popular account of the decade, but O'Neill treated Eugene McCarthy as a major figure of the era and totally ignored the man who set much of the rhetorical agenda for these years. The same could be said of Todd Gitlin's 1987 study, The 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage. Why? It seemed an important question to answer. And so I decided to write a biography of George Wallace. I like to think immodestly that I was at least partially responsible for a revival of and an awareness of the role he had played in the 1960s and 70s. First, with the biography, The Politics of Rage, and then with the release of a 3-hour PBS documentary in 2000, George Wallace Set It in the Woods on Fire. Now, that was 15 to 20 years ago, a lifetime in today's fast-moving political landscape, and I've moved on to other research and writing interests. But I couldn't keep from thinking about the connections between past and present during this political season with the rise of Donald Trump, from millionaire real estate developer and television personality to Republican nominee for the presidency. During that time, he's been linked, at least by liberals, to a variety of historical figures, even to the greatest villain of our time, Adolf Hitler, which I think is absurd. But a more common reach back into history has been to compare him with George Wallace. Despite having retired in 2009, I seem to be on every reporter's speed dial, anxious for a quick one-line quote on the latest gaffe or outrageous Twitter by the Donald, and the historical connection to the late Governor Wallace. Well, after a number of these calls, I decided to make a pitch to the New York Times to write an op-ed piece. Having read most of the journalistic comparisons, I thought I had a different perspective. All of us are familiar with the cited quote by American philosopher George Santayana. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. As a historian, I've always been uncomfortable with that phrase because it seems to suggest that the lessons of the past are easily transferable to the future. Well, nothing is more deceptive than attempts to make the past simply an early draft of the present. What I suggested in my email to the one Times op-ed editor I knew was a different take, to use the comparison between Trump and Wallace to talk about the ways in which historical investigation and analysis can be useful precisely when we're trying to understand a past situation that's different from the present, to which it often bears a superficial resemblance. I quickly discovered this was not a subject of great interest to the editor. To be fair, she reminded me that this was a 1,200-word essay, little more than a gesture toward explaining complex issues. And ultimately, that's what my op-ed piece became, a jester, suggesting a few similarities, a couple of differences, leavened with a little humor. So now you must pay the price. Yes, there are similarities between these two poltergeists, as I call them, George Wallace and the politics of the 1960s, and Donald Trump and the politics of the 21st century. And I'll return to what I think is the most important one. But the differences intrigue me as well. And those differences have as much to do with the political world in which they operated as the issues themselves. Since I retired, I've continued to research and write, and I skim through the quarterly journals of the various historical associations, but I no longer feel compelled to maintain my professional bona fides, dutifully puffing my accomplishments for one of those annual departmental reviews in the hope that it may raise my paycheck a few shekels. Social Security and my TIAA retirement fund at least keep me off the breadlines. But I retain my interest in political history, an interest that has only intensified during the past year. At the risk of offending some of my Republican friends, I will say that the emergence of Donald Trump as a major party nominee for the presidency has sent me scrambling to understand what the hell is going on in this, one of the oldest continuous democracies in history. That freedom from class preparation and blue books has allowed me to read in fields that were terra incognito, to use the Latin a decade ago. Some of it in fiction. You know, when you're a historian, you don't have time for fiction. Now I do. And halfway through reading the Barchester novels of Anthony Trollope, I'm convinced that anyone who wants to understand the struggle between empathy and compassion on the one hand in our society, and the greed that shapes our economic culture on the other, should begin by reading the works of that incredibly insightful Victorian writer. But that's not what I'm going to do. I'm not going to talk about Trollope's novels. I'm going to begin in a different place. I'm sure that many of you are familiar on some level with the arguments of George Lakoff, who is professor of linguistics at the University of California, Berkeley. Although he has long been known in the related fields of neuroscience and cognitive linguistics, he emerged as a national popular figure in 2004 when he published Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values, and Frame the Debate, a kind of informal guide for liberals in their political struggles against conservatives. He is a liberal, very unabashed one. Since then, he has gone on to publish his ideas in a number of books, as well as dozens of articles and contributions to liberal websites. For more than a quarter century, Lakoff has insisted that the fundamental divide in today's politics stems from the fact that liberals and conservatives subscribe to two distinct metaphors that shape their attitudes and beliefs about the role of government and the decisions we make, political decisions we make in American society. Now, I'm not going to talk about the metaphors. They are, if any of you remember, the dominant father, which is a Republican metaphor, conservative metaphor, and the nurturing parent, which is a Democratic liberal one, which I think is nonsense. If you ever tried that out in debate with a really sharp member of Young Americans for Freedom, he'd have his clock cleaned, I think. What is important, and what I think has had a more lasting impact, is his insistence that liberals have foolishly continued to operate under the misguided assumptions of 18th century rationalism. We engage in political debate and reach agreement by intellectually analyzing and examining issues. In a political context, if you tell voters the facts, however complex, they will balance their self-interest with their moral instincts and ultimately reach compromises that promote the common good. Nonsense, says Lakoff. What contemporary cognitive scientists have discovered is that the Enlightenment theory of reason doesn't describe how people actually think and how they make decisions. People think, he said, primarily in terms of cultural narratives, stereotypes, frames, metaphors. As another leading neuroscientist explained, politics is not about changing minds through arguments and evidence. It is about framing issues by configuring and reconfiguring neural pathways, repetitive, comforting, emotionally attractive, and morally appealing narratives, metaphors, mottos, and mantras are most likely to gain neural traction. Now, Lakoff's ideas have not gone unchallenged. The fields of cognitive neuroscience and cognitive linguistics are often as contentious as, say, historians. But he is hardly alone in his contention that individuals, voters in a political context, are essentially intellectually passive, lazy. In the Bible, and it's considered to be the most important survey of cognitive studies, a book called Social Cognition from Brains to Culture, the authors summarize their field by arguing that human beings are by nature cognitive misers. That is, they prefer to do as little as thinking as possible, instead relying upon emotional and often buried assumptions. Now, these theories are based upon social science research, laboratories, scientific studies, and I'm no scientist. I discovered that it was possible, as I spent about 3 weeks, 4 weeks reading in the field. I discovered that it was possible to follow the fundamental arguments as long as you avoided the second glass of wine at dinner. Then it became a little tricky. But even though I think I understood the arguments, the research, it left me cold. It didn't really answer key questions, and it certainly left me uneasy at the prospect of accepting a political system, a democratically run political system that relies so heavily upon the dismissal of rationality and the embrace of unconscious, non-rational cognitive impulses. So I tried to approach the issue from a somewhat different perspective. If this is where we are today, has it always been this way? If not, what are the historical signposts along the way that mark a fundamental transition in our modern political system? Clearly, the work of linguists and neuroscientists has brought a level of sophistication to the process of how we think, how we make political decisions. But long before the public's awareness of the work of neuroscientists and linguists like Lakoff, advertisers and politicians had begun to understand the possibilities of manipulating first consumers and then voters in this changing world of media and communications. In that process, George Wallace was in many ways a transitional figure in the transformation of American politics. He had one foot in the past of 19th century stump speeches and another in the new electronic world of television. We talk about the crowds that greet candidates, 30,000 for Donald Trump on one occasion in Mobile, mostly in the 4,000 to 8,000 range. Well, if Governor Wallace was still with us, I can hear his response, chicken feed crowds. And he was right. It wasn't just the size of his audiences. He packed Madison Square Garden with the largest political rally in history, New York City. It was his ability to draw gatherings of 20 to 30 to 40,000 night after night during his 1968 campaign. In that sense, he was the last of the old-time public orators who built a following the hard way, campaigning to audiences across the nation week after week. Today we live in a different world, a different political universe. There are many facets that have created a new and often brutish, I think, political world in which compromise has become a dirty word and politics has descended to the kind of vicious conflict once reserved for gang wars and feuds between the Hatfields and the McCoys. Boston Globe reporter Michael Cohen argues that it was the election of 1968 that set the stage for the next half-century of divisive politics. In his book, The Big Sort, my friend Bill Bishop describes how Americans have separated themselves geographically, economically, and politically into like-minded communities over the last 4 decades, a sorting process that he argues has exacerbated economic inequality, cultural misunderstanding, promoted political extremism, and legislative gridlock. We could also talk about the rising power of a new moneyed class, uncompromisingly devoted to far-right policies and given carte blanche to use their vast wealth for political ends in Citizens United. I'm sure we could all think of other factors that have led to bitter partisanship and legislative gridlock. Gerrymandering. I live in a state where 2012, 2014, and it looks like 2016, 50 to 55% of the voters will vote Democratic. But because Republicans gathered a narrow majority in 2010, they were able to gerrymander the state to such an extent that 2/3 of the members of the legislature are Republican, 10 of the 13 congressmen are Republican, and less than 10% of the members of the legislature have any effective opposition in the coming election. It certainly leads to a great deal of cynicism. And before I cast stones only at Republicans, I have many good friends in Maryland, in which the Democratic Party did exactly the same thing. Gerrymandered it to such an extent that Republicans have virtually no voice in the state, even though they make up well over 40% of the voters. Republicans are better at it, but that's a different story. But what I'd like to do this morning is not to talk about these issues, as important as they are, but to discuss the sea in which all these forces swim, the media matrix in which political ideas are disseminated and contested in our society. Now, technologies of communication have been changing for a long time. The telegraph, newspapers, mass magazines, radio, all subtly change the way we receive and process information, political or otherwise. But television marked a quantitative transformation. I said that Governor Wallace had his foot in the old political world of stump speaking and direct and informal contact with voters. At the same time, it is clear that he would not have exploded onto the American political scene in the absence of his use of television. While working on the PBS documentary about Governor Wallace, I watched films and outtakes of his early career in front of a television camera. He was awful, awkward, boring, droning on like a high school social studies teacher speaking to a group of very slow students. But he was always a quick study, and he soon adapted his speaking style, as he did in so many other instances. His extraordinary political instincts allowed him to see the emotional power of television and the ability of the performer, himself in this case, to reach his audience not with long, boring, detailed policy expositions, but with fragmentary phrases and ideas that evoked a passionate, emotional response. Television, from the very beginning, reduced a politician's arguments to a couple of sentences, a few phrases, even in the 1960s, when audio clips and television stories tended to be longer than today. Now, other political figures from the 1960s and 70s were more calculating in their exploitation of the new media, drawing upon the lessons of advertising and the new consumerism. If any of you are interested, I would strongly recommend Jackson Lear's History of Advertising in America, Cultural History of Advertising. He talks about the way in which a number of academic psychologists beginning in the 1920s began to advise advertisers about how they could sell their products to make it more scientifically. As I read their advice, it basically boiled down to this: you have to appeal to the most basic human emotions: hate, fear, insecurity, envy, even compassion. The important thing was to understand that buying a product was seldom a rational process. At some point, of course, the line between politics and merchandising disappeared. Historians may debate the exact point of that transition. After all, politicians from the very earliest days of democracy were concerned with projecting an image. Abraham Lincoln was a successful, well-to-do Illinois attorney long after his followers continued to describe him as a rail splitter and to point to his birth in a Kentucky log cabin. The aristocratic Franklin Roosevelt was a master through radio of controlling the public's perception of him as an approachable friend and potential confidant. As one writer said to him, "You're the only person that would know that my boss is a son of a bitch." Dwight Eisenhower, you may know, hired one of Hollywood's best-known actors to give him advice on his speeches and public presentations. But the most dramatic shift seems to take place in the 1960s, first with John Kennedy's effortless manipulation of television and his brief presidency, and then the big shift, Richard Nixon. It's no accident that several of Nixon's closest advisors, Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman and Nixon spokesman Ron Ziegler, came straight out of the advertising industry, as did a number of his other aides and advisors. I counted 7 at one point in the White House. Speechwriter William Safire and a young and ambitious Roger Ailes were trained in television production and public relations. 6 months before Nixon announced his candidacy for the president in early 1968, H.R. Haldeman, had prepared a memorandum which laid out the critical role which television would play in that campaign. Political rallies, and particularly exposure to skeptical newsmen, were counterproductive. It was time, he said, for political campaigning to move out of the dark ages and into the brave new world of the omnipresent eye of television. Haldeman, Brave New World. Haldeman, not noted for his mastery of Western literature, apparently failed to grasp the ironic implications of his use of Aldous Huxley's chilling phrase, Brave New World. Television, he said, would allow minimum exposure and the opportunity for the maximum manipulation, and that is the word he used, of the electorate. As another of Nixon's media advisors told him shortly before his nomination, voters are basically lazy. They are basically uninterested in making an effort to understand what you're talking about. Reason requires a high degree of discipline, of concentration. The emotions are more easily aroused, closer to the surface, more malleable. It's the aura that surrounds the charismatic figure more than the figure itself that draws the follower. Our task is to build that aura, which was a heck of a job with Richard Nixon. Long before the language of framing became ubiquitous, politicians were learning how, on their own, how to use language, linguistics, to achieve their goals. In the late 1980s, an ambitious young Republican congressman from Georgia named Newt Gingrich began conducting seminars for young GOP operatives on how to frame political issues. One of the key pieces of advice was a word list he created and distributed, a list he insisted that should be memorized and used in every speech and every piece of written material. In describing yourself and fellow Republicans, he said, you should use words like caring, common sense, courage, pro-life, freedom, hard work, initiative, liberty, moral, pro-flag, prosperity, protect, reform, tough, pro-family. For Democrats, there was a slightly different vocabulary. Sick, traitors, corrupt, bizarre, cheat, steal, devour, self-serving, anti-family, pathetic, incompetent, criminal rights. Repeat these over and over, Gingrich said, and unconsciously it will create a sense among voters that Democrats are untrustworthy, indeed un-American. I have to be careful here. It's too easy to fall into the nostalgia trap, particularly as you grow older. Oh, God, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. I think I heard my grandfather say that and my father say it as well. Few issues seem to be more susceptible to this feeling for those of us who are older than a review of the mixed impact of television and the new technologies of communication that have followed with the development of the World Wide Net and vastly improved computing power for our various devices. Well, I don't think of myself as a Luddite. I watch television. I have worked as an advisor and scriptwriter and on-screen commentator on nearly 24 documentary films. It would be a bit awkward for me to dismiss television with a broad brush, nor am I immune to the advantages of modern technology. In 1979, I paid $1,298 for an Apple II computer. That's $4,000 in today's currency. This for a machine with the computing power of a television remote. I was in the first training email session at Emory in 1991. I obtained a cell phone after I got back from a year in Italy in 2000. And I certainly embraced the ease of information and its access from across the global village. But there's a price, as we all know, to be paid for our wired generation. Marshall McLuhan famously argued that the medium is the message. That's clearly an overstatement, but it is certainly true that the way the forms of communication have dramatically altered, that the forms of communication have dramatically altered the way we receive and process information, and it has had a profound impact on our political culture. A decade ago, I talked with Bill Moyers about a possible panel. Actually, he contacted me to discuss the impact of the shifting emphasis from print media to mainly at that point television news. In 2005, 80% of the American people said that they received most of their information about politics and public policy from watching television and secondarily listening to talk radio. So we talked about this, and I prepared myself. I had been on his show the year before, and I knew how good he was, but he expected you to be prepared. I spent 60 hours in the summer of 2005 viewing the evening news, the fading networks, CNN, Fox, MSNBC. And I concluded at the end of this exercise, and it was sometimes a painful exercise, the problem was not the inherently conservative or liberal slant of the television news. Yes, there was a difference in what Fox covered and what MSNBC covered. There was a difference in their perspective. But the real, it was not even the way that television had become a business geared solely to raising audience share and increasing stockholders' returns by turning the language of civil life into sensation, melodrama, and amusement. If it bleeds, it leads. It was the sheer irrationality. Stop watch in hand. I took notes. And in one 10-minute time block, it was a kind of whirlwind of advertisements for erectile dysfunction, for a 40-second piece on something that was totally unrelated to the next section, then a little happy talk, then a little debate that goes on for about a minute and a half in which the two people are shouting over each other. A story from Iraq in which they've had a suicide bomb, and the commentator mentions that 3 Marines have been killed in Fallujah, but passes on with that because they have no film. It's not interesting if you don't have some film. In this jumble of disconnected facts and talking heads, logic, reason, sequence, context totally disappear. One fact is important as another. No, any sensational or entertaining fact that can be presented with visual materials is far more critical than complex issues like growing economic inequality, the aging of our population and its impact on the social network, global warming, the dangers of nuclear proliferation, the underlying causes and consequences of the Middle Eastern crisis. For years, conservatives complained about postmodernism among academics and the loss of fixed standards of truth and factuality, but today's television news has become the very essence of postmodernism. Well, now, flash forward to today. While television remains the main source of news and political information, it's increasingly challenged by net news. More than 20% of Americans today get all their information, or almost all of it, from social media, Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. And that percentage is almost twice that high among individuals under 30. The majority, whether watching television or their computers or their iPhones, still rely heavily upon visual images, descriptions, and fragmentary accounts of what is happening in the world. Twitter, with its maximum 140 characters, seems the perfect vehicle for the new age. So what's the problem? A lot. I'm afraid I share the misgivings of literary scholar Alvin Kernan, as Kernan complained in his deeply pessimistic work, The Death of Literature. The rise of television and all that has followed in its wake has had a profound impact on how we receive, understand, and analyze information. And this is a quote: "Where the printed work was stable, endurable, available in fixed form for rereading, the electronic image floats, transitory and infinitely recombinable in new configurations. Where the dense literary verbal text, gone over and over again, encourage complex readings, the TV image is directly and literally superficial, what is on the surface." In many ways, Neil Postman's 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business, foreshadowed Kernan's uneasiness about the reliance upon a media that rewards the superficial at the expense of the complex. But Postman, I think, proved even more prescient in describing a second aspect of this emerging culture, the blending of entertainment and politics, or perhaps I should say, the triumph of entertainment over politics. We expect to be entertained, and if we are not, we grow restless. And yet, at some level, we all know it's a fraud. Image making, framing, manipulative techniques to which we feel superior even as we respond to their allure. Should we be surprised at the cynicism that now grips the American electorate? So where would George Wallace fit in this new culture? Given the limitations imposed by his time in history, and I think his entire career was in effect shaped by the fact that he came of age as a politician in the 40s and 1950s. I remember talking with Jimmy Carter about this when we were working together at Emory, and he said, I was luckier than George Wallace. I came along just a little bit later, just enough so that I didn't get dragged down by the race issue in the way that he did. But it's always difficult to imagine. It's really a parlor game to imagine where he would stand today. The past is another country, and so is the future. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme a lot." He actually didn't, but I like the quote anyway. And here I am convinced there is one piece of rhyming, of continuity, the damning, the scapegoating of the other. From our earliest days as a republic, fear and hatred has been evoked to attack Catholics, Mormons, the Irish, Eastern Europeans, and above all, African Americans. when one candidate speaks of Mexican rapist, an un-American Muslim terrorist, all of whom should be barred from America, it is not a rejection of political correctness. It is bigotry. And the superficiality of much of the viscerally oriented media hardly helps to inform the public about the complexity of these issues. I don't mean to suggest that the crisis we face can be explained only by the pulsing screens that now light our world. But sorry, my phone is vibrating here. I hope you're. But I refuse to believe that the way we should confront these issues is by spending our time and energy trying to reduce complex issues to cartoon images that can be framed and presented in emotional bullet points and then projected on the digital screens, all to achieve political victory in the next election. And so my Jeremiah ad draws to a close, a long tradition of this in American history. But assuming there is any merit to my forebodings, what is the solution? There's the rub. We can't, for example, turn the clock back in time and destroy all our new handheld devices of communication. Although I should say, this past summer, sitting in 35 concerts at the Brevard Music Center, watching bored attendees set the concert hall aglow with their phones as they texted, exchanged photos, and scrolled down their apps while I tried to concentrate on the music, it did evoke some pretty irrational, primitive impulses on my part, like wanting to walk through the aisles and grabbing them and slamming on the floor. Susan Jacoby, author of The Age of American Unreason, sees an inevitable declension driven by the triumph of video culture over print culture, the disjunction between Americans' rising level of formal education and their ignorance of basic geography, science, and history, and the political fusion of anti-rationalism with anti-intellectualism. And perhaps she is right. But nothing historical is inevitable, and changes come when we least expect them. When Governor Wallace, then Representative Wallace, took office in the Alabama legislature in the late 1940s, less than 5% of the state's eligible African Americans were registered to vote. Alabama was an incredibly poor state, but poverty rates among blacks were truly extraordinarily high, as much as 80 to 90% in some counties. Abysmal educational opportunities were available for black Alabamians, and strictly enforced job segregation meant there was little opportunity to move into a middle-class existence, let alone to achieve wealth. Today, this state, like the nation, is far from a just or a fair society, but it is different, and it is better. So there's much work to be done in rescuing our political culture. It will not be accomplished by turning our backs on the heritage of rationalism that reaches back to the Renaissance, or by failing to recognize that moral ends cannot be separated from the way our politics should operate, with a commitment to civil discourse and a willingness to listen, not just debate, with those with whom we disagree, and above all, with a bedrock commitment to respecting the worth and dignity of every individual. These are lofty goals, and the chasm between the way we are and the way we ought to be makes us feel frustrated, angry, and often overwhelmed. Dorothy Day, the great Catholic defender of the poor, recognized that sense of futility a long time ago. People say, "What is the sense of our small efforts?" she wrote to one of her friends as the Great Depression deepened. They cannot see we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. A pebble cast into the pond causes ripples that spread in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, words, and deeds is like that. No one has a right to sit down and feel hopeless. There is too much work to do. Thank you very much.
Dr. Carter. We're going to open this up for questions. If you would please raise your hand, and either Georgia Ann or myself will pass the microphone to you so everybody can hear your question. Thank you.
Dr. Carter, you mentioned that the South moved generally from a solid South Democrat to almost a solid South Republican. And my question is about the 1976 election. Do you think the 1976 election of Jimmy Carter kind of was an exception to that trend?
Yes, it was. I think there were a number of reasons that it was an exception. One is that in 1976 you still had a residual number of Southerners who, in fact, in many ways were turning toward the conservative Republican Party, but changing political traditions is hard, and there was still a kind of carryover of this vote. But to me, the main factor was this sense of pride on the part of white Southerners that finally we have one of us, an evangelical, a true Southerner, not like Lyndon Johnson. And I think those factors together were enough. And the fact that Carter was very successful in riding the wave of disgust over the Nixon. I mean, he did that. I'll never lie to you became a very powerful kind of mantra in that election.
Given the history of Republican moderation, I'll call it, political moderation in the 60s, and given the fact that George Wallace was a Democrat, I'd like to hear your version of the factors that drove Southern Democrats to the Republican Party.
I can tell you what I think. There is, of course, a great deal of dispute about this. I've been to 2 symposiums in the last 7 years in which we didn't exactly square off with pistols at 50 paces, but there are historians who believe that what happens in the South is simply as the South becomes more prosperous, as the middle class develops, you get the same kind of movement of individuals, white Southerners in this case, into the Republican Party that you did in the suburban North, for example, during the period of the 60s and 70s. That makes sense? I don't believe that. I think race was played a critical role in the 1960s. I just don't think you can look at either the hard data or just the newspapers or any kind of historical examination of the period. Race played a critical role. The other thing that may be related to it, but is different, and that is, it's not just that quote, racism is perhaps more evident among white Southerners, having grown up in segregation and so forth. It's that the region is very socially conservative. And as the Republican Party increasingly embraced a kind of social conservatism, I think many white Southerners responded to that as well. I'll be glad to give you my article in which I make my argument on that it was a combination of factors, but race was really certainly in the 1960s and 70s, it was a critical one, I think. Uh-oh.
We have one back here.
Yeah.
Are you a troublemaker?
I was hoping my friends wouldn't show up here.
Dan, on a fairly optimistic or more optimistic note, maybe, Wallace didn't win.
Yeah.
And Trump probably isn't going to win.
I hope not. I said in my New York Times op-ed piece he wouldn't.
I guess my question is that more is that better explained by the fact that rationality outweighed the McLuhan kind of message media thing? Or is that because the Democrats and the Republican mainstream folks back in the 60s were better able to use framing to frame Wallace with the help of people like William Bradford Huey and others who followed him around from Alabama and said, that's hardly the real story of Alabama. And this would be particularly appropriate for the way in which Democratic media people framed Donald Trump between the Republican National Convention and yesterday. So that if the only thing that mattered in politics now is media framing, maybe people who frame cognitively are different from people who frame emotionally. If you follow that kind of logic.
Yeah, I do. I don't agree, but that's... No, I understand exactly what you're saying, and it is absolutely true that if you go back and look at the you talk about continuity, there is certainly continuity in the way in which the mainstream media, if you want to call it that, treated Wallace and treats Trump. Now, they are able to do so, particularly in the case of Donald Trump, because he gives them such rich material to frame him. I mean, Governor Wallace was a lot more clever, I think, in seeing the traps involved than Trump. He was a lot better politician. But I think in both cases, the emotional, non-cognitive is what's at work here. Americans may be angry, they may be upset, and many are, but the majority are not crazy. And so they see someone like Donald Trump, for example, as someone who's dangerous, and they emotionally react to that, I think. And maybe that is partly cognitive, partly emotional. What my being a real pessimist that I am, it's a lifelong characteristic of having lived and voted in the South all my life. What really worries me is less Donald Trump than a future Donald Trump, than someone who is far more skilled and far more able to balance how far to go, how to manipulate these emotional responses. And I think one of the things that in looking back on the '68 campaign, Governor Wallace, and I get this from talking to some of his friends, said, you know, we made a mistake in 1968. We used that campaign to arouse people to support us, and so much so that particularly this sort of playing off against radicals and hippies, and that was extraordinarily useful in bringing out our support. The problem was, he said, they set up two cameras, one for me to talk and one for the riots that went on. And the American people might have liked what I was saying, more of them, but they didn't like what they saw with that second camera, with people throwing chairs at each other. And I think I worry a lot more about somebody who has that kind of insight and realizes that there is a way that you can go a lot further. Yes, Randall, yeah.
Sorry, that was our last question. It's time for our break. So let's thank Dr. Carter again for coming.
Oh, thank you.